The 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler broke the planet of Cadia and ushered in the modern 40k universe, the great rift forever dividing the galaxy in two. But it was just one more step in a plan that had been brewing for thousands of years, each of the 12 crusades that preceded it filling in a piece of the puzzle. So, let's go through them all. Abaddon the Despoiler is kind of the big bad of Warhammer 40k, though to be fair in 40k everyone else is too, but anyway, he's a big one. Since his rise to power after the Horus heresy, he's been fighting what the Black Legion call the Long War against the Imperium. And long it is. Over 10,000 years, numerous raids and war fleets had ventured forth from the Eye of Terror, but the biggest incursions were named Black Crusades. At least, they were named that by the Imperium. The term Black Crusade is used for a lot of different campaigns in 40k, not just the really famous ones, but often for just smaller insurgencies of wars waged by the servants of chaos. Sometimes the heretics themselves call it that, sometimes it's a name given by a particularly paranoid inquisitor, but Black Crusades can and have been launched by all sorts of chaos warlords, their size and scale varying enormously. It's just the most famous ones that are Abaddon's ones, the numbered 13 Black Crusades that started shortly after the Horus heresy and ended with the destruction of the Eye of Terror and the spread of the Great Rift. 13 colossal incursions that ravage the Imperium and, well, sometimes feel a bit small? Right, one of the issues with doing a video like this is that some of the Black Crusades aren't very well fleshed out, and that's a product of how this lore came to be written. Abaddon was introduced way back in 2nd edition, in the very first Chaos Codex, along with the concept of the Long War and the idea that great lords of chaos might lead Black Crusades. At the time, it was noted that Abaddon had led 12 that ranged from raids to full invasions of sectors, and it gave a few small details and stated that the Imperium feared the day he would unite chaos into an even bigger one. Then, during 3rd edition, his 13th Black Crusade was detailed for the first time, at least what became the first part of it, as Abaddon finally achieved that goal and started his invasion of Cadia. Mostly, I think, because having the big end of the millennium mega constantly ongoing war be the 13th Black Crusade kind of just sounds cool. So for a long time, the 13th was really the only one that mattered. Then, years later, when the Black Legion received their own supplements, well, someone had to write some extra fluff, and it feels like they mostly came up with one specific thing for each crusade, and then left it there, sometimes folding in some of those earlier stories. And looking at them now, some of them seem a bit too small. Are we really going to believe that an entire terrifying Black Crusade was launched just to sort of vaguely fight over a single Space Marine homeworld for a little while and then go home? Or to attack this one single fortress? It was all a bit thin until the release of Gathering Storm and the conclusion of the 13th Black Crusade back in 2017. Here, it's revealed that every crusade so far was just a stepping stone, the War Master moving his pieces into place. That's the point of the Long War, after all. To Abaddon, Horus's headlong charge on Terra back in the Heresy was an act of hubris only a Primarch could consider, a decision made from a point of arrogance, and that's why he lost. Abaddon spent 10 millennia in the Eye of Terror, a place where time has no meaning, so he's in no rush. And with that context, all those previous stories then make a little more sense, because in each of these stories, that's what the Imperium thought was the point of the Crusade. The Imperium might think they've come out victorious over Abaddon's latest attempt at an invasion by winning this single battle on a single world, but in reality, there was always an ulterior motive. The Black Crusades weren't failed invasions, that was just a diversion. In reality, they were just missions to capture a relic, to weaken the barriers of real space just a bit, to cement an alliance, all with the goal of bringing about things like the Great Rift. And when you look at them in those terms, then their scale makes a lot more sense. So just bear that in mind as we go through them, because despite the silly memes, each of these crusades was one step forward in a plan millennia in the making, and one that would eventually lead to the Warhammer we know today. In the 700 years since the Horus Heresy, the traitor legions had almost torn themselves apart within the Eye of Terror, devolving into competing warbands. But eventually, Abaddon, former first captain of the Sons of Horus, had risen to prominence and attempted to unite them under the banner of his new Black Legion. It's important to note that the Black Legion wasn't a successor or a replacement for the Sons of Horus. Abaddon laid the blame for the failure of the heresy firmly at the feet of Horus. In fact, one of the first actions of the nascent Black Legion was the destruction of the Emperor's children's attempts to clone the War Master. Instead, the Black Legion was an attempt to regain the brotherhood of the old legions through a dedication to what he called the Long War, a slow, painstaking, and carefully constructed campaign to eventually destroy the Imperium. And as far as the Imperium were aware, this started with the first of the Black Crusades in 781 M31. The First Crusade's apparent initial target was Cadia. In the years since the heresy, the Imperium had recolonized and started to resettle Cadia as a watch station for the Eye of Terror, guarding the only stable route in and out of the Eye called the Cadian Gate. Small raids from the Eye had become relatively frequent affairs, held in check by a picket fleet that included elements of the Black Templars under their now ancient original commander, Sigismund. But what emerged from the Eye this time was far bigger than anything they'd seen before. Abaddon had mustered the largest force of traitor warbands thus seen, and they swarmed from the Eye, overwhelming the defenders and spreading across the nearby sector. Various Chaos chieftains leading their warbands in the first of many assaults on Imperial worlds. Cadia itself, at that point sparsely populated, was almost overwhelmed as demons poured from the skies. Other warbands continued to emerge in the wake of Abaddon's. Zagtheon the Broken led his warband in an orgy of violence across the Agri world of Valencia. An Erlak's raptor company assaulted the floating hive cities of Melfia, tearing them from the skies and killing millions. The Black Legion were bloodied against the Imperium for the first time across dozens of fronts, but to Abaddon, this was not only a way to unite his new army, but the first step in a more subtle plan. Dedicating the bloodshed of the Crusade to the Dark Gods, he was gifted with knowledge, the location of the Tower of Silence on the planet of Uralan. As the initial push of the Crusade died down and his rampaging forces moved on, Abaddon and a retinue of the Black Legion's elite warriors and sorcerers followed secret warp paths to the planet and fought the tower's guardians, demonic entities of dark energy. There, at the very heart of the tower, at the centre of a mind-bending labyrinth, Abaddon encountered a towering figure of golden light who led him to the true objective of the First Crusade as he pulled into reality the great demon sword Draknyen, a blade born from the spirit of the first human murder and which constantly strove to spill the blood of humanity's king. In the meantime, the Imperium had finally realised the scale of the threat and dispatched many of the newly formed Space Marine chapters to the area, who slowly pushed the remains of the traitor forces back to the Eye. But from this point on, raids and incursions grew more and more common, and the Imperium eventually reinforced Cadia by constructing naval bases at Bellis Corona and an inquisitorial watch fortress at Nemesis Tessera. But both of those would be the targets of the Second Crusade. 800 years later, in 597 M32, the Eye opened and the Black Legion descended in force again. Warbands spread out in every direction, diversionary attacks landed across the sector and on Cadia itself, and a wave of hexes and curses affected Imperial worlds. But the first true target was, well, these new constructions. At Bellis Corona, Abaddon and his bodyguard slaughtered the inhabitants of the Outer Moons and used their remains to invoke a curse, embedding within the system a mutagenic plague that would awake on command centuries later. Imperial forces were thrown into disarray by the speed of the assault and redeployed to the system, but by the time they arrived, Abaddon was gone, appearing on Nemesis Tessera and assaulting the Inquisition fortress. In a swift and brutal fight, the Legionnaires forged a path down to the hexagrammically warded cells beneath the fortress and broke them open, freeing one of the demonic inhabitants, before the entire crusade evaporated, and Abaddon led his forces back into the Eye, his objective complete. In the wake of this second crusade, the Imperium stepped up their defences again. Nemesis Tessera and Bellis Corona were reinforced, and Cadia slowly turned into the impregnable fortress world it remained for the next 8,000 years or so. And so when, a few hundred years later, the Eye opened and another great crusade began, the Imperium initially assumed that, like with the last crusade, Cadia would be the target. This time though, Abaddon would not be leading the assault. He made a pact with the demon prince Talamin, convincing him that the blood of the Adeptus Astartes would make him strong enough to defeat his chaotic rivals within the warp. When the Eye opened again in 909 M32, it was the hordes of Talamin who descended to Cadia to batter themselves against its defences. The demon slaughtered his way through the Astra Militarum defenders, luring in elements of a dozen different Space Marine chapters with its distress calls. But while the demon prince was eventually banished by warriors of the Space Wolves, yet again, the entire assault was a diversion. While the Imperium had been fighting hordes of demons on Cadia, Abaddon's forces fell on Gestahl. The shrine world of Gestahl was named for Saint Gestahl, and it was dedicated to the worship of the Emperor. An ancient prophecy existed that in the far future, the saint would rise again when the Eye of Darkness opened for the last time, and that the saint would stem the tide of the treacherous. Obviously, none of that could be allowed to happen, so while the Imperium was distracted at Cadia, Abaddon led his Black Legion in an assault upon the Shrine World, casting down its alabaster cathedrals and breaking the seals on the ancient tomb and destroying the saints' remains. The Fourth Crusade would also set the tone for many of the ones to come. By this point, Cadia was an impenetrable fortress world that commanded a ring of defences that surrounded the exit from the Eye, sufficient to stop most Chaos raids and war fleets if they could be detected. But when crusades were called and fleet after fleet would emerge from the Eye, their forces could engage the immediate Imperial defences, overwhelm those picket fleets, launch diversionary attacks on Cadia itself, and then push past the picket in the direction of what their true objective actually was. With the size of the Chaos fleets growing each time, and the Imperium unaware of when an attack would actually come, a new Black Crusade became a dreaded event, something the Imperium could never totally contain, especially in the face of other rearing Xenos threats. But after the loss of Gestahl, the danger to the Imperium seemed to die down, and attacks on the scale of the first three Crusades weren't seen for another 1,000 years. Within the Eye, though, Abaddon had been busy. At the opening of the 34th millennium, the Despoiler returned, this time at the head of a massive army formed not only of the Black Legion, but of allies drawn from across all the old traitor legions, and on a mission to remove the string of Imperial defences that had been built up around the Segmentum. In 01 M34, they swept out of the Eye, past Cadia, and onwards past the fleet base at Hydrafor towards their true target, the world of Elfanor. Elfanor was one of the key defences against raiders attempting to slip out from the Segmentum Obscurus and onwards to the Segmentum Solar, ruled by an Imperial commander called the Cromarch, and it had repelled countless attacks over the years. Abaddon led a force of Black Legionnaires and diverse traitor legions with the sole aim of removing the fortress world from its path. They landed on the floodplains of Erebor outside the Grand Citadel and commenced a punishing siege. There was no diversion or trickery this time, just a straightforward assault on the fortress, weathering punishing fire from the artillery of the Imperial Guard. They forced their way up to the Adamantium Gates, the path littered with the broken bodies of Black Legionnaires, and Abaddon split them asunder with Draknien. The traitors poured through the citadel, the War Master personally taking the head of the Cromarch, and with that final sacrifice, a portal opened and demons spilled out, first slaughtering the rest of the garrison and then falling on each other. While the Chaos forces descended into infighting, Abaddon led the remnants of his Black Legion back into the Eye, leaving a gaping hole in the Imperial defense network that protected the Segmentum Solar. Most of the Crusades, up until this point, had been concentrated on targets within the Segmentum Obscurus, near the Eye itself, but after the Fourth Crusade, Abaddon had obviously set his sights on targets further afield. The Fifth Black Crusade, commencing in 723 M36, ranged further afield than any had before. Its target was the faraway Elysia sector, and no area of the sector was spared. Known to the Imperium as the Tide of Blood, the Fifth Crusade engaged the Imperial Navy across the sector as the forces of Chaos led small invasions across dozens of worlds, brazenly destroying shrines and temples and attempting to provoke as large a response as they could, such as when the Flawless Host rampaged across the agri-worlds of Galvan. This initial phase ended with the destruction of the ancient imperial city of Khazir-Lutin on Tarinth. The Black Legion then holed up in the city, enslaving the populace and waiting for the inevitable retribution fleets. But when they arrived, in the form of the Warhawks and Venerators chapters of Space Marines, the true plan became apparent. The Black Legion conducted a great ritual, sacrificing the entire population of the city, 10 million people, to their dark gods, opening a warp rift in the skies, and summoning Doombreed, the greatest of all Khorne's demon princes. Abaddon had promised the demon the skulls of an entire chapter of Space Marines in return for his service, and as hordes of demons poured into the city and the Black Legion went on the attack, his promise was fulfilled and both chapters were destroyed. The Fifth Crusade continued to drag in forces and had long-lasting effects. The ritual shattered warp seals across the sector, weakening the barrier between real space and the warp, and leading to unchecked psychic mutation in years to come. Doombreed's invasion was only eventually stopped by a contingent of Blood Angels. Then, the Sixth Crusade saw Abaddon cement his position amongst the servants of Chaos even further. In 901 M36, just a few hundred years after the Fifth Crusade, he made a pact with the Chaos warband known as the Sons of the Eye, who also comprised ex-Sons of Horus and were led by their warlord, Drekkarth the Sightless, one of the few rivals Abaddon still had left. But Drekkarth and his warband were formidable allies to have. Drekkarth himself was one of Horus's captains during the heresy, and he'd formed his warband out of many of the Legion who had initially refused to follow Abaddon, famously defeating a greater warband of the World Eaters a few years later, and then growing ever stronger since. United, these two forces, the Black Legion and the Sons of the Eye, broke out of the Eye of Terror and fell upon the forge world of Arkreath, slaughtering its inhabitants and casting down its forge ziggurats. But at the culmination of the battle, when the two warlords stood victorious in the ashes, Abaddon turned on his rival, thrusting the claws of the Talon of Horus into Drekkarth's gut. And with their leader dead, the Sons of the Eye swore themselves to Abaddon and joined the Black Legion after all. Having reinforced his position within the Eye, the Seventh Crusade came almost a millennia later. Known as the Ghost War, it started, much as the others had, with a huge Chaos fleet pushing out past the Imperial defences of the Cadian sector in 811 M37, but then it seemed to disappear, dispersing into a number of different directions, the fleets and warbands fading into the void between stars. Soon, raids and battles were erupting all over nearby Segmenti, many targeting the Blood Angels chapter. A contingent of the chapter were defeated by Chaos warbands at Midan, though they were saved at the last minute by the intervention of the Karkarodons, emerging from the Outer Deep after millennia away from the Imperium. Their sacrifice was later memorialised on the cemetery world of Hypastis in carvings that showed grey-clad Astartes with black discs for faces. Khan the Betrayer of the World Eaters allied with the Warmaster and led a contingent of Khorne berserkers in the destruction of the Blood Angels ship the Sanguine Tear, and on Makan, almost the entire chapter, supported by elements of the Rampagers chapter, were lured to the surface by Abaddon and his Black Legion. Despite having their full strength behind them, the attack was a disaster. Much of the chapter were wiped out, and the Black Legion desecrated their corpses and returned to the Eye with their gene seed, later to be used by Fabius Bile in the creation of new Black Legionnaires. The Eighth Crusade then came pretty quickly. It hit less than 200 years later in the form of a meticulous plan that unfolded across a number of systems. Like before, in 999 M37, traitor fleets pushed out from the Eye, split into various directions, and disappeared. Then, the individual raids started, first on the moons of Tychus, where 8 of the 20 ancient crater cities were stripped of their shields and opened up to the void, their inhabitants freezing in place. Over the next few months, more mathematically significant rituals were enacted. Known as the Skull Gather, tens of thousands of Imperial citizens were killed across the segmentum, their bodies left in ritualistic patterns. A Chartist vessel, the Divine Path, was halted by raiders and 999 of its passengers murdered in ascending order of the pilgrim tokens they carried. The Andromax system was assaulted by warbands from the Night Lords and the Iron Warriors, and since the system's capture was a direct threat to Terra, the Adeptus Custodes of the Dread Host were called to reclaim the system, fighting alongside the Minotaurs chapter and the Adeptus Mechanicus. And finally, on the Forge world of Rithcan, the Black Legion sacrificed the Tech Magi, feeding them into the gears of their own manufactorums. Throughout, the Inquisition drove their scribes and savants to madness trying to decipher the War Master's plan, but eventually the truth was revealed. These attacks were all part of a greater ritual dedicated to Tzeentch. As the plan unfolded, strange constructs beneath those opened crater cities on Tychus began to glow until, after the 9th ritual slaughter, the constructs underneath the cities melted. With those mysterious constructs under Tychus gone, the forces of chaos disappeared once more. From that point, the Crusade seemed to gain some focus. The 9th Black Crusade arrived in 537 M38, though some conflicting sources place it earlier, at some point between the 7th and 8th, which is weird. Whenever it was, the goal seemed to be the weakening of the Imperial naval fortress of Cancephalus, but that wasn't immediately apparent because initially the Crusade seemed directed elsewhere, falling on the world of Anticanus IV. Anticanus was a teeming hive world that supplied much of the labour to the nearby fleet base. The 9th Crusade, the Black Legion, allied with elements of the Word Bearers, the Purge, the World Eaters, and the Apostles of Minthras, and accompanied by hordes of demons, quickly swept through the orbital defences and commenced a planetary bombardment, destroying much of the planet with cyclonic torpedoes. The traitor Marines then landed, herding the survivors into long lines of slaves bound for their landers, while Abaddon himself and the demonic forces of the demon prince Dar-Leth concentrated on the capital of Monarch Hive, sweeping through its lower levels and besieging the upper spires. The Imperium attempted to respond, but raising the required regiments would take time. The Silver Skulls chapter deployed in force, initially harassing the Chaos Fleet in orbit, and so Abaddon sped up his conquest, leading the final assault upon the capital himself with his Terminator bodyguard, and massacring the PDF and Arbites garrisons, as well as much of the populace as he could at once. Then, when the first dropships of the Imperial Guard appeared in system, he ordered the Black Legion to depart the planet, breaking through the Silver Skulls fleet and leaving his allies behind to dig in. The war to try and retake Anticanus lasted 17 years, during which time the Black Legion fleet caused havoc in nearby sectors. Multiple Space Marine chapters were deployed to the area. 2 separate chapters, both called the Celestial Swords, were destroyed completely, and the Lamenters, recently recalled to defend the sector, suffered predictably crippling losses attempting to defend the hive world of Corilla from chaos attack, something they attempted on their own because the superstitious Mortifactors chapter just refused to fight alongside such an ill-omened force. Eventually reduced once again to just 200 battle brothers, the survivors of the Lamenters were rescued by strike forces from the White Scars and the Ultramarines. Of course, the war on Anticanus had the desired effect, and the naval base at Cancephalus was weakened so much by a lack of manpower that its fleets could barely put up any resistance. For almost 2 decades, Black Legion raiding fleets moved wherever they wanted, Abaddon sorcerers enacting various rituals that weakened the barrier between real space and the warp across the region. The next crusade would come just under 500 years later in 001 M39, but rather than breaking through the Cadian Gate, Abaddon had other plans this time. During the 10th Crusade, he made a pact with the demon prince Perturabo and opened an ancient warp route out of the Eye of Terror to the galactic north, bypassing Cadia and its defences and falling on the sectors and systems north of the Eye. The Helican subsector was badly hit, the majority of the Black Legion fleet scattering across scores of planets, the main thrust aimed at Thracian Primaris, the capital of the sector. But again, that was a feint. Abaddon himself accompanied Perturabo and his Iron Warriors as they lay siege to the Medusa system, home of the Iron Hands chapter and an ancient repository of pre-imperial archaeotech. The War Master observed from the bridge of his flagship as Perturabo took apart the outer defences of the system piece by piece, the Iron Hands struggling to hold back the tide as their fortifications were ripped apart, a good part of the chapter lying dead on the rocky ground of their homeworld. But just as the promised Imperial reinforcements arrived in system, the traitor forces dissipated, falling back to the empty void. Nobody in the Imperium knew why they disappeared so quickly, or what their objective really was. Some suggested it was merely the testing of the Medusa system's defences in preparation for some later campaign, but for whatever reason, the Black Legion and the Iron Warriors returned to the depths of the Eye. And then, 300 years later, Abaddon again attempted to assail the Imperium by a non-conventional route. In 301 M39, he bound a Demon of Tzeentch within his flagship, in an attempt to find a path through the warp storms that bounded the Eye and avoid the Cadian Gate once again. However, this time, something went horribly wrong, and the demonic navigator, driven mad in the storms, scattered the ships of the fleet across real space. Warbands of the Death Guard were thrown out of the warp near the Subiaco Diablo sector, unleashing waves of plague zombies infected with the Destroyer Plague in a battle against the Snake Bones chapter of Marines, eventually infecting them and corrupting them into the Plague Bones Chaos Warband. Abaddon's Black Legion Warfleet was deposited right into the path of the Orc War of Murgor Undredteeth, currently in the process of attacking the Cardinal world of Reloria. Undaunted, the War Master took the opportunity to despoil the planet anyway, entering into a brutal three-way war on the surface with the goal of capturing as many of the Orc Weird Boys as he could. His hold then full, he pulled his forces back from the surface, leaving the Orcs and the Imperium to continue the war as his sorcerers utilised the psychic energies of the Orcs in a ritual that, once again, weakened reality across the sector. After the semi-disaster of that 11th Crusade, no major incursions plagued the Imperium for the next millennia, but it seemed that the War Master was biding his time and building his forces, because the 12th Black Crusade was to be the largest and most destructive one yet. Known to the Imperium as the Gothic War, the 12th Black Crusade was a vast campaign waged across the Gothic sector and made up of hundreds of planetary invasions and pitched naval battles that lasted 2 decades, from 139 to 160 M41. The war is way too vast and complex to go into in much detail here, but after years of warp storm build-up that effectively isolated the sector, it became apparent that a major invasion was underway as Imperial fleet bases came under heavy attack. Abaddon led missions to Purgatory and Orn's World to recover the ancient artifacts known as the Hand of Darkness and the Eye of Night, harried by a pursuing Imperial Inquisition. Eventually, he deployed a colossal Chaos battleship known as the Planet Killer against the Cardinal world of Savavan, destroying the planet and its inquisitorial fortresses, along with all record of those 2 artifacts ever existing. He then used the artifacts to gain entrance and then control of the Blackstone fortresses, 6 ancient and vast pre-imperial battle stations that hung in the void, retrofitted as imperial defense stations. The whole war came to a head at the Battle of Gethsemane, where the Imperial Admiral Ravensburg managed to use the combined strength of Battlefleet Gothic, reinforced by fleets from the White Consuls, Exorcists and Red Talons chapters, and allied Eldari forces to split the Chaos Fleet and trap their forces in the Schindelgeist system. In a colossal space battle, the traitors were finally routed, but Abaddon escaped with 2 of the Blackstone fortresses intact, destroying the other 4 to cover his tracks. By the end of the war, after 20 years of pitched naval combat and planetary assaults, billions have been killed, multiple planets completely destroyed by the Planet Killer, 4 of the Blackstone fortresses destroyed, and the final 2 stolen and moved into the Eye of Terror. It was one of the largest conflicts of the entire 41st millennium, by far the biggest of the Black Crusades to date, and a massive reminder of exactly how dangerous the War Master had become. And then we get to the big one. The 13th Black Crusade was the culmination of all this planning. All the mysterious missions, all the plans to weaken real space, all the rituals and destruction of ancient artifacts and constructs, and all the building of alliances within the Eye seemed to be in service of this one goal. Over the previous millennia, Abaddon had fundamentally weakened the bounds of real space around the Eye of Terror, including destroying many of the ancient pre-imperial Blackstone constructs that, it turned out, held the Eye in check and maintained the warp storms around its perimeter. All that was left was the linchpin of that network, Cadia itself. Preempted by a sharp rising cult activity known as the Plague of Unbelief, in the closing years of the 41st millennium, the hordes of chaos once again poured from the Eye and towards the surface of Cadia. Cadian High Command, by this point on alert, issued recall orders and reinforced their forces, but the cult activity reached further than they thought, and on the landing fields of Tyrok, the Volskani cataphracts turned traitor and slaughtered the Cadian leadership in a suicidal attack, just as the outer planets of the system started to fall to the invaders. It fell to Ursicari Creed of the Cadian 8th to assume command, taking on the title of Lord Castellan of Cadia and sending hundreds of requests for aid as the Chaos forces barreled ever closer. What followed was a grueling and desperate war in which the initiative would swing back and forth as both sides poured reinforcements into the conflict. Abaddon's initial invasion destroyed many of the Cadian Khazars and pushed Imperial forces back across the planet, but was halted when Imperial reinforcements started to arrive. The Blood Angels, Dark Angels and Space Wolves chapter, along with many others, committed huge forces to the defense of the system. Astra Militarum and Tempestus Scions forces were dispatched by the Inquisition, and Saint Celestine herself led a host of the Adeptus Sororitas to the planet's surface, temporarily forcing a stalemate, and this stalemate was where that 13th Black Crusade was held from 3rd edition all the way through to the end of 7th. Anyway, Abaddon was to regain the initiative as the second half of his Chaos fleet emerged from the Eye of Terror, led by one of those 2 stolen Blackstone fortresses, the Will of Eternity. Desperate battles were fought for control of Cadia's planetary defences, the defenders barely holding on in time for another wave of reinforcements aboard the Imperial Fist's battle station Phalanx to arrive and then destroy that Blackstone fortress. But while beneath the surface, Belisarius Cawl and the Necron Trays in the Infinite had managed to activate the pylons, there was still one last swing of the war to come as the Black Legion attached massive starship engines to the remnants of their Blackstone fortress and drove it into the planet's surface with the strength of a meteor strike. The surface of Cadia cracked and split, and the planet fell apart. Imperial forces desperately attempting to evacuate as the planet collapsed around them. Millions were lost as Cadia finally fell, and with it the ancient technology that kept the Eye of Terror in check. As the effects of the Cadian pylons dissipated, and without any other Blackstone artifacts left to hold it back, the warp spilled over into real space, and the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, started its spread across the galaxy. The Great Rift was the culmination of Abaddon's plans, at least for now. It led to the weakening of real space barriers across the galaxy as the unspace of the warp divided Imperium Sanctus from Imperium Nihilus and massively weakened the Imperium, a huge step forward in their long war. Though for now, it's still a mystery exactly what each of those preceding Black Crusades contributed. Were the constructs beneath the moons of Tychus more Blackstone barriers? Was the invasion of Medusa a plan to destroy even more of the network, or steal technology that could be used in later Crusades? Was the Citadel of the Chromarch another ancient relic that needed to be removed? At the moment, we don't know. So that's it. The 13 Black Crusades of Abaddon the Despoiler spread over 10,000 years, growing from relatively contained raids and missions to literally galaxy-changing wars. It's unclear if there needs to be a 14th. Now the Great Rift divides the galaxy and chaos is everywhere, there's no prison left to break free from. But even though the term might now be a bit redundant, the long war still continues, in ever more intricate ways. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to find out more about the events of Warhammer 40k, there should be a link just popping up there on the right. And if you'd like to support the channel, there's another link to the Patreon in the thing below. See ya.